In a small Texas town, where everything seemed perfect on the outside, a shocking betrayal unfolded within the walls of a home that no one could have ever imagined. A respected detective, known for her sharp mind and control over everyone around her, would stop at nothing to protect her image, even if it meant taking the life of the one person she claimed to love. But this wasn't just any murder, it was a crime of vengeance, hidden behind a dinner table and a deadly secret. What happens when a wife's obsession with perfection leads her to betray not only her husband, but her very family? Stay with us as we dive deep into the twisted case of Detective Rachel Carter, a woman who would go to any lengths to protect her ego and career, even if it meant killing the one person closest to her. This is the story you won't believe. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss an episode of Real True Crime Stories, where we uncover the darkest secrets hidden in plain sight. In the small, tight-knit town of Willow Creek, Texas, life moved at a gentle pace. The sun-drenched streets, lined with old oaks and charming homes, painted the perfect picture of peace. Neighbors waved as they passed, children played freely in the yards, and everyone knew everyone's business. But behind this idyllic facade, dark secrets festered, waiting for the right moment to break through the surface. Detective Rachel Carter was the queen of this quiet town. At 36, she had built a reputation as a force to be reckoned with in the local law enforcement community. Her sharp mind and unwavering dedication to justice made her a respected figure. Her colleagues admired her decisiveness and her ability to crack even the toughest cases. On the outside, Rachel was everything a small town could hope for in a professional woman: confident, driven, and always impeccably put together. At home, Rachel's life appeared to be just as perfect. She was married to Mark Carter, a mild-mannered school principal who had grown up in the town. Together, they had built a life that seemed flawless. 2 beautiful children, a cozy home on the outskirts of town, and the kind of marriage that others envied. To the world, they were the picture of success, a family everyone admired, seemingly living the dream. But behind closed doors, the story was much darker. Rachel's need for control over every aspect of her life, especially her marriage, was suffocating. While she presented herself as the ideal wife and mother, her behavior was far from perfect. At home, she was controlling, emotionally manipulative, and demanding. Mark, once outgoing and confident, had gradually shrunk into the background of their life together. His every move was scrutinized, his decisions second-guessed. It was as if Rachel's constant need for validation and perfection had pushed him into the role of the obedient, passive husband. As the years passed, the cracks in their marriage became more apparent. Mark began coming home later, spending long hours away from Rachel and the kids. He grew more secretive, retreating into himself, no longer the man he once was. His once open demeanor became closed off, and his behavior raised red flags for Rachel. She noticed the subtle changes in his routine, the unexplained late nights, the guarded conversations, the sense that he was hiding something from her. Mark's behavior had become erratic in the weeks. He would come home late, sometimes hours after dinner, with no explanation, offering excuses that felt hollow and rehearsed. "There was a staff meeting I lost track of," or "I had to stay after school to help a student." Each time he said these words, there was a tremor in his voice that made Rachel's stomach tighten, but she said nothing. He was always quick to change the subject, making small talk, but never once meeting her eyes for more than a fleeting moment. The distance between them grew. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the silence that followed him into the house, the absence of warmth in his smile, the way his shoulders would tense as he walked past her. She watched as Mark became less and less himself, more withdrawn, more secretive. The man who used to laugh with her over dinner now sat in silence, his mind elsewhere. Rachel knew something was off. As a detective, she trusted her instincts. Her eyes narrowed when he started leaving his phone on silent, or when he made excuses to avoid being home. She couldn't explain it, but the familiar sense of control she had once commanded in her marriage was slipping away. She didn't ask him directly. Instead, she started to watch more closely, gathering small pieces of evidence, details that didn't add up. The late nights. The strange, almost guilty look in his eyes when he came home. The moments when his phone buzzed, and he'd hurriedly glance at it before turning it face down. Her suspicions took root. She assumed it was another woman, her jealousy, her insecurities bubbling to the surface, feeding the growing paranoia in her mind. She had always been meticulous in her work, and now she applied that same careful attention to Mark's every movement. She installed a GPS tracker on his car without him noticing, checked his phone records when he wasn't looking, and even drove past his office late at night, parked just out of sight, waiting for him to slip up. She became obsessed, a detective on a personal case, watching his every step. Then, one evening, her surveillance finally paid off. Rachel followed Mark to a quiet, unassuming house on the edge of town. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched him walk inside. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the proof she needed. But as the door closed behind him, Rachel froze. Something felt off. Her heart sank as she saw an elderly man, her father, Tom Reynolds, step into the doorway to greet Mark. Rachel's stomach twisted in disbelief. Her father, the man she had always looked up to, the man who had been a steadfast presence in her life, was involved with her husband in a way that was beyond her comprehension. She had always admired her father. Tom Reynolds, a 61-year-old retired pastor, had been the moral compass of their family. A man of faith, a man of integrity, or so she thought. But here he was, standing in the doorway of his home, holding the hand of the man who had pledged to love her forever. Rachel's vision blurred as a wave of humiliation washed over her. Her father, her husband, two men she trusted more than anyone in the world, had been hiding a secret. A secret that cut deeper than any affair with another woman ever could. The shock was almost unbearable. Rachel's pride, her carefully constructed image of the perfect life, shattered in an instant. She felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her hands trembled, her breath shallow as she sat in her car, fighting the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Rage bubbled up from deep within, hot and violent. How could they do this to her? How could they betray her so completely? The thought of her father and husband together, in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine, was enough to push her to the brink of madness. Over the following days, Rachel was a woman on the edge. Her mind would not stop racing, replaying every moment she had shared with Mark, every word, every touch, every time they had been together. Had there been signs? Had she missed something? She couldn't stop thinking about the way her father had greeted Mark, the ease with which they stood together, the familiarity between them. The betrayal cut deeper than any affair with another woman ever could. She had been blindsided by her father's role in this sordid affair. The anger that consumed her was like nothing she had ever felt. It burned hot and vicious, a deep, unforgiving rage that threatened to consume everything she had left. She confronted Mark, her husband, the man she had trusted with her life. He stammered, his voice shaking as he confessed. "Yes, Rachel, it's true," he said, his words coming out in ragged breaths. "I've been seeing your father. I never meant for it to happen, but it did. I've been struggling with who I am, and your father, he helped me understand myself, helped me find comfort. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Please, I'm sorry. Please forgive me." The words felt like a slap in the face, each one a painful reminder of how completely Mark had betrayed her. Her father, her rock, was no different than the other men who had hurt her. She felt no sympathy for Mark. Instead, she saw only the extent of the humiliation he had brought upon her. His plea for forgiveness was nothing more than a desperate attempt to save himself. But Rachel had already made up her mind. She would never look at him the same way again. The life they had built, the marriage, the family, the career, was all a lie. Mark had destroyed everything, and now, Rachel would make him pay. But as she looked at him, helpless and broken before her, she realized that this betrayal wasn't just personal. It was an assault on her entire identity, a threat to the perfect image she had so carefully crafted for herself. The anger bubbled up in her, fueled by a deep, searing need for revenge. Rachel's plan unfolded in the quiet, shadowed recesses of her mind, a calculated act of retribution that she believed would restore the power she had lost. For days, she obsessed over the details. Each move, each gesture had to be perfect. She needed to make sure Mark would never suspect a thing, that he would walk right into the trap she had set, thinking it was nothing more than a simple dinner between a loving husband and wife. The evening began like so many others. The house, usually silent in the late hours, was filled with the warm, familiar smells of Mark's favorite meal. She had carefully chosen it: grilled steak, roasted potatoes, and a side of vegetables, just the way he liked it. She set the dining table with meticulous care, ensuring that everything looked as it should. Soft lighting, the glow from the candles flickering on the table, and the wine she knew he would enjoy, all these details were part of her performance. There was no hint of the darkness that simmered beneath her composed exterior. She wanted him to feel at ease, to believe that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. Mark came home, his demeanor slightly off but still willing to smile and greet her. He was tired, but he smiled at her, never suspecting what was about to unfold. Rachel greeted him warmly, playing the role of the loving wife. She kissed him on the cheek and led him to the table, where the meal was set. He sat down, oblivious, as Rachel placed the meal before him. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. She poured him a glass of red wine, watching as he took the first sip. His eyes brightened as he tasted the familiar flavors of the food. He smiled, and Rachel felt a brief moment of satisfaction. As a detective, Rachel had spent years studying the intricacies of human behavior, crime scenes, and forensic evidence. She had seen countless ways in which people had tried to cover their tracks, using poisons, drugs, and methods designed to cause harm without detection. Over the years, she had developed a keen interest in toxicology. It was one area she was particularly fascinated by, knowing that the right substance could be administered without raising suspicion. And for this particular evening, Rachel had chosen thallium, an odorless, tasteless poison that would go undetected until it was too late. It was the perfect weapon. Slow, insidious, and almost impossible to trace until it was too late. She had purchased the thallium few days earlier, knowing she would need it for the day she would finally confront Mark's betrayal. The poison would not act immediately. It would take hours for its effects to manifest. This was precisely why Rachel had chosen it. She knew Mark would consume the meal without hesitation, without any suspicion. He trusted her completely. As they ate, Rachel watched him closely. He didn't notice anything unusual. He didn't know that with every bite he took, the poison was slowly making its way through his body. She kept up the conversation, her voice calm, her face a mask of concern as she listened to his ramblings about his day. She nodded and smiled, acting the part of the wife who cared, the woman who was still clinging to the illusion of normalcy. Meanwhile, inside, her heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins as she anticipated the gradual unfolding of her plan. Hours passed, and Rachel watched as Mark began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. At first it was subtle, he shifted his weight, his face pale beneath the warm glow of the candlelight. He winced as if a dull ache had begun to form deep within his abdomen. Rachel's eyes never left him as he swallowed a mouthful of water. He tried to continue their conversation, but his voice began to sound strained. His movements, once fluid and easy, grew slower, more deliberate. Then the nausea hit. His stomach churned, a deep, unsettling pain that made him clutch at his midsection. His face twisted, his breath shallow as he fought to maintain composure. "I don't feel right," he muttered, his voice thick with discomfort. Rachel barely contained her excitement as she watched him deteriorate. This was only the beginning. The poison was starting to work. The symptoms rapidly escalated. His skin became ghostly pale, a sheen of sweat beading on his forehead. The dizziness hit next. He stood up suddenly, swaying on unsteady legs, and nearly collapsed as he stumbled towards the kitchen. Rachel watched him, her pulse quickening. She feigned concern, rising from her chair as if to help him, but she stopped herself. No, she wouldn't touch him. Not yet. Mark groaned, his stomach convulsing in pain. He tried to steady himself against the kitchen counter, but his legs betrayed him, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap. His breath came in shallow gasps, his face now tinged with a bluish hue. "Rachel, what's happening to me?" he gasped, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide with confusion. He clutched his stomach, curling into a fetal position, his body racked with spasms. Rachel stood there, her hands trembling but her face cold. She watched as Mark's body gave way to the poison, his organs slowly shutting down, unable to process the toxin. His eyes were glassy, his lips turning blue as his body fought against the poison that was wreaking havoc within him. The once confident, mild-mannered man who had betrayed her was now reduced to a shell, groaning in agony as his body shut down. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as Rachel remained by his side, pretending to comfort him while he writhed in pain. His body became unrecognizable. Skin blotched and mottled, his extremities cold to the touch. His lips were almost purple, the telltale sign of thallium poisoning. But Rachel remained calm, controlling her emotions, keeping the mask firmly in place. By the time Mark collapsed into unconsciousness, his body having gone into seizures. The paramedics arrived too late, their efforts futile. They pronounced him dead before they could even get him into the ambulance. And Rachel, still in shock, feigned disbelief. She cried, but the tears didn't touch her soul. She avoided touching Mark's body, careful not to leave behind any forensic evidence that could link her to the poisoning. The scene was a chaotic blur, but Rachel's composure remained intact. The investigation would be slow. It would take time for anyone to suspect her. The poison had done its job perfectly. But as she walked away from the wreckage of her marriage, she knew one thing for sure: she had gotten away with it. For now. When the investigators arrived at the scene, the house was eerily quiet, save for the whirring of the air conditioning and the soft shuffle of their shoes on the hardwood floors. The paramedics had already left, and Rachel was alone in the living room, her face a carefully crafted mask of sorrow. She sat on the couch, clutching a tissue, her eyes swollen from fake tears. The death of her husband, Mark, had shocked the small community, and Rachel played her role to perfection. To the investigators, she was just another grieving widow, caught in the grip of an unthinkable tragedy. At first, there was nothing about the scene that suggested foul play. Mark had been found unconscious on the kitchen floor, but there were no signs of a struggle or violence. His body was cold and stiff, his skin pale and slightly bluish, but the initial assumption was that his sudden collapse was due to a health condition, something cardiac or a stroke perhaps. The investigators noted that Rachel seemed surprisingly calm. She answered their questions without hesitation, almost too composed, but nothing immediately raised alarm. She was a detective herself, after all. Her role in law enforcement gave her an air of credibility, her every movement seemed rehearsed, calculated. However, as the investigation continued, small but peculiar details began to emerge. The coroner's report noted the odd discoloration of Mark's skin, especially around his lips and extremities. His face had taken on a deathly hue, with a bluish tint that didn't fit the expected patterns of death by natural causes. His arms and legs were mottled, an unsettling mix of purples and dark reds. The forensic team immediately flagged the condition, they had seen it before. It was a telltale sign of circulatory failure, often caused by poisoning. The autopsy confirmed their suspicions. Mark's organs showed signs of severe damage, especially to his liver and kidneys. His blood had thickened, and his cardiovascular system was failing. But it was the toxicology report that sent shockwaves through the investigation. The lab results revealed the presence of elevated thallium levels in Mark's system, an odorless, tasteless poison that left no immediate signs of foul play. The investigators pored over the report, their minds racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift. Thallium poisoning was rare but not unheard of. It was a substance that could be easily administered without detection, and its slow, agonizing effects made it particularly insidious. The elevated levels in Mark's blood were a clear indication that he had been poisoned, deliberately and with great care. As the toxicology report spread across the investigation team, their focus shifted. The suspicion fell on Rachel's father, Tom Reynolds. The retired pastor had been implicated in the affair with Rachel's husband, Mark, and his involvement seemed too significant to ignore. The affair, now confirmed, painted a sordid picture of betrayal and deceit. Could Tom have been part of some twisted plot? Was he involved in the poisoning? The investigators began to question Rachel more thoroughly. She had been the one to discover Mark's body and had called the authorities, but there were aspects of her behavior that were unsettling. She never once seemed to collapse into genuine grief. Her calm, almost detached demeanor felt off. When the investigators pressed her, asking for more details about the day of Mark's death, Rachel gave them measured answers, as if reading from a script. She didn't break down once, not even when discussing the loss of her husband. Moreover, Rachel's avoidance of Mark's body raised additional concerns. When the paramedics arrived, she had been careful not to touch him, standing back with an almost clinical air. She hadn't even moved to attempt CPR or offer any comfort in the moment. Her hesitation to touch him was out of place for a woman who had claimed to love her husband deeply. In fact, it was this behavior that triggered the first inklings of suspicion. The investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that Rachel had played a role in her husband's demise. But the forensic evidence was still inconclusive. The focus shifted back to the poison itself, thallium. The question was, how did Rachel know about thallium, and why did she use it? As the days passed, the investigation took a dramatic turn. They remembered Rachel's background in law enforcement and her extensive knowledge of poisons and toxicology. Rachel's expertise in forensic investigation made it harder for her to feign ignorance. The authorities began to piece together a more disturbing theory. Could Rachel have used her position as a detective to orchestrate the perfect crime? Had she laced Mark's food with the poison in a cold, calculated move? The investigators weren't ready to accuse Rachel outright, but the evidence was beginning to suggest something far more sinister. With the toxicology report in hand and Rachel's increasingly suspicious behavior, they knew they had to dig deeper into her actions. The slow unraveling of her perfect facade had begun, and the truth seemed closer than ever. The authorities had a new target in their sights, and Rachel Carter, the grieving widow, was no longer so untouchable. As the investigation unfolded, the evidence against Rachel grew increasingly damning. Investigators had meticulously combed through her personal belongings, and in one crucial discovery, they found traces of thallium in Rachel's kitchen and personal items. The poison, which had been used to kill her husband, Mark, was now clearly linked to her. It wasn't just an isolated incident. Rachel had not only had access to the poison but had also gone to great lengths to procure it, all pointing back to her as the perpetrator. The timeline that the investigators pieced together was equally revealing. It showed a carefully orchestrated series of events, with Rachel's meticulous planning coming into focus. From preparing Mark's favorite meal to administering the poison at just the right moment, every step seemed intentional, designed to ensure his slow and agonizing demise. Her professional background in law enforcement, specifically her knowledge of poisons, made it all the more chilling. The authorities had now built a clear case of premeditated murder. The trial was nothing short of intense. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the prosecution laid out its case against Rachel. Her once carefully constructed image of the perfect wife and mother was slowly being dismantled in front of the jury. Rachel, sitting at the defense table, still wore the mask of the grieving widow, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had just wept for the loss of her husband. But those who had been following the case closely knew that beneath that mask, there was something far darker at play. Rachel's defense team tried to paint her as a victim of betrayal, claiming that the affair between Mark and her father, Tom, had driven her to the brink of madness. They argued that Rachel's actions were those of a woman devastated by her husband's betrayal, unable to cope with the crushing weight of her emotions. But the jury, seeing through the defense's attempts to paint her as an emotional wreck, remained unmoved. They saw a woman who had carefully planned her husband's murder, not a woman driven to insanity by an affair. Rachel's narcissistic tendencies were on full display throughout the trial. She seemed unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. While the prosecution presented evidence of her premeditated actions, Rachel remained composed, almost aloof, in the courtroom. She was caught in lies and inconsistencies, her testimony riddled with contradictions. At one point, she claimed she was devastated by Mark's death, yet her lack of any genuine emotion only alienated the jury further. Her behavior was cold and calculated, as if the death of her husband was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her life. Her emotional detachment was particularly noticeable when the prosecution introduced the evidence of her controlling behavior toward Mark. Rachel's emotional abuse of her husband was well documented, and witnesses came forward to testify about her manipulative and domineering nature. Mark's friends and family described how Rachel had isolated him, controlling his every move and decision. The jury listened intently as they heard how Rachel had slowly chipped away at Mark's sense of self-worth, using her power as a law enforcement officer to manipulate him into submission. But it wasn't just the evidence of abuse that painted a damning picture of Rachel's character, it was her complete lack of remorse. Throughout the trial, Rachel remained poised, never once breaking down or showing any real emotion. When confronted with the horror of her actions, she remained silent, her expression unreadable. Her lack of remorse was striking, and the jury could not ignore it. They saw a woman who had coldly planned and executed the murder of her husband, and they were not swayed by her attempt to play the role of the grieving widow. The prosecution hammered home the point that Rachel had been in control the entire time. They showed how she had meticulously planned every detail of Mark's death, from choosing the poison to preparing his final meal. They painted a picture of a woman who had not acted out of a moment of rage but out of a calculated desire to regain control over her life, no matter the cost. The defense's attempt to claim Rachel had been driven to madness by the affair was utterly undermined by the overwhelming evidence of her planning and deliberate actions. As the trial drew to a close, the jury deliberated long and hard, weighing the evidence against Rachel. The case had been clear. Rachel Carter had murdered her husband in a cold and calculated act of revenge, driven by a toxic combination of narcissism, control, and emotional abuse. Despite her attempts to portray herself as the victim of betrayal, the jury saw through her facade. The prosecution's case was strong, and the evidence was overwhelming. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Rachel's face remained expressionless as the jury found her guilty of murder. She had failed to maintain her carefully crafted image of the perfect wife, and the truth had come to light. Her actions, her calculated poisoning of her husband, her lack of remorse, and her narcissistic tendencies, had led to her downfall. As the gavel struck, Rachel's fate was sealed, and the dark secret of her perfect life was finally exposed to the world. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, a heavy silence filled the air. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were on Rachel, who sat confidently at the defense table, her face a mask of calm. The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson of the jury stood, the weight of the moment bearing down on everyone present. The verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder. Rachel's expression remained unchanged for a moment, as if the words hadn't fully sunk in. But as the full weight of the verdict hit her, cracks began to form in her composed facade. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes wide with disbelief, yet her pride refused to let her show any real emotion. The woman who had once prided herself on being the perfect wife, the admired detective, the pillar of the community, now faced the consequence of her own actions. The narcissism that had driven her to kill her husband, her need for control, her obsession with appearances, was now unraveling in front of everyone who had once believed in her. The judge, having heard the chilling details of Mark's murder, sentenced Rachel to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no leniency for her calculated crime. As the sentence was announced, Rachel remained defiant, her lips tight in a thin line, her jaw clenched. She refused to acknowledge the enormity of her actions or show any hint of remorse. In her mind, she had done what she had to do, what she believed was justified. Her world was shattered, but her narcissism kept her from showing vulnerability. The tears that others expected to see never came. Instead, she stood tall, her pride her only companion in the face of the unforgiving sentence. In the weeks that followed, the town was left in shock. A small, close-knit community, where everyone knew each other, was forever changed by the revelation of Rachel's crime. The people who had once admired her, her colleagues, friends, and even her family, now grappled with the horrifying truth. How had they all been so blind to the woman who had lived among them, hiding her darkness behind a veil of respectability and charm? The betrayal was almost too much to bear for some. Those who had known Rachel as the epitome of the perfect wife, mother, and professional detective now saw her for what she truly was, a woman consumed by narcissism and a need for control, willing to destroy everything and everyone around her to maintain her dominance. Her colleagues in law enforcement were left questioning everything. How had they missed the signs? How had Rachel, a seasoned detective with an eye for detail, turned the very skills she had honed in her career to commit the perfect crime? The shock was compounded by the knowledge that someone they had worked alongside for years, someone they had trusted and respected, had harbored such a dark secret. Her colleagues were forced to reconcile the professional woman they had known with the cold, calculating murderer she had become. Family members, too, were left to grapple with the truth. Rachel's parents, who had watched their daughter rise through the ranks of law enforcement, could hardly believe that she had been capable of such a horrific crime. But as the layers of her life were peeled away in court, the evidence was undeniable. Rachel had used her position of power to manipulate and control, driving her husband to the breaking point, and when he no longer served her purposes, she had murdered him without hesitation. Her mother and father, once proud of their daughter, were left to question where they had gone wrong, how they had failed to see the signs. As the town came to grips with the aftermath, a sense of betrayal lingered in the air. Rachel's once perfect life had been destroyed by her own actions, and the facade she had so carefully built had crumbled. Her marriage, her career, and her reputation, all had been shattered in an instant. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence and the gravity of her crime, Rachel refused to show any remorse. Her actions had been deliberate, calculated, and driven by a toxic need for control, and now, in the cold confines of a prison cell, she would face the consequences. The story of Rachel Carter was a tragic reminder of the dangers of narcissism and unchecked control. It illustrated how a person's need for power and perfection can consume them, leading them to destroy everything they hold dear. Rachel had spent years building a life that appeared flawless to the outside world, but behind closed doors, she was a ticking time bomb, waiting to implode. Her story serves as a chilling example of how the quest for control can lead to the destruction of not only others but oneself as well. As Rachel was led away from the courtroom, her face expressionless, the finality of the moment was clear. Her life, as she had known it, was over. The perfect wife, the admired detective, the beloved mother, none of it mattered now. In the end, Rachel had been consumed by her own need for control, and that desire had cost her everything. The town would never be the same, forever haunted by the truth behind Mark's murder. Rachel's colleagues, friends, and family would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the woman they thought they knew, the woman who had turned her greatest strength into her most terrifying flaw. And as Rachel was escorted to prison, the chilling reality settled in. The perfect life she had worked so hard to create had been nothing more than a facade, destroyed by her own hand. As the story of Rachel Carter comes to a close, we are left to grapple with the chilling reality of her actions. A woman who once commanded respect, who seemed to have it all, beautiful family, a respected career, and a seemingly perfect life, was ultimately undone by her own psychological flaws. Her need for control, her inability to handle rejection, and her deep-seated narcissism were the driving forces behind the murder of her husband, Mark. She couldn't bear to lose the image of perfection she had so carefully crafted, and when betrayal reared its ugly head, her response was not one of empathy or understanding, but of cold, calculated revenge. Rachel's story is a stark reminder of the dangers that lie within when a person's ego becomes more important than the lives of those around them. She saw her husband's affair not as a betrayal of their marriage, but as an attack on her identity, her status, and her carefully constructed life. Unable to tolerate even the smallest hint of imperfection in her world, Rachel resorted to the most extreme measure possible. Her emotional abuse had already driven Mark to the brink, and when the truth of the affair came to light, she took matters into her own hands, poisoning him in a slow and deliberate manner. But Rachel's narcissism went beyond the murder itself. It manifested in her complete lack of remorse, her ability to play the role of the grieving widow, and her unwavering belief that she had done nothing wrong. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, she maintained that her actions were justified, that her need for control outweighed everything else. Her downfall was not just the murder of Mark, but the way her own psychological makeup, her inability to accept imperfection, her obsession with power, led her to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. The courtroom drama, the chilling revelation of the true motives behind Mark's death, and the final, gut-wrenching moments of Rachel's sentencing serve as a testament to the consequences of unchecked narcissism and control. Her life was shattered, not by the world around her, but by her own decisions. Her refusal to change, her inability to see beyond her own ego, sealed her fate. As we reflect on Rachel's story, it serves as a warning: the pursuit of perfection, the need to control others, and the inability to process rejection can have devastating consequences. In relationships, whether personal or professional, when our egos and insecurities take the wheel, the damage can be catastrophic. So, I leave you with a question. How many times do we let our egos and insecurities get in the way of healthy relationships? The toxic patterns of behavior we allow to persist can be far more destructive than we realize. If you or someone you know is in a toxic, abusive relationship, it's time to seek help. No one should ever feel trapped in a life of control and manipulation. Reach out, take that first step, and remember, your worth is not defined by the control others have over you. Seek support, and break free from the cycle. If you found this case compelling and chilling, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the dark truths behind the facades people build. Together, we can raise awareness and help prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Stay safe, and take care.